Bret Weinstein. Hello.
Chris, how are ya?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Doing all right. Good to meet you.
Boy, it's good to meet you. I've been listening to you for a bunch of years now, actually. So
Nice.
it's
Glad to hear
great to
that.
meet you well, not in person, but it's great to talk to you directly. I've heard your voice so many times through a podcast. It's like I know you.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I mean, I do sort of think like this is, yeah, in person is a strange term for it, but it's pretty darn close.
It gets as close as it can get, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've had a lot of conversations over the years, and you get to know a person online. I'm sure you have the similar experience as
Oh,
what I
yeah.
do, and you just feel like you get to know someone, and it's just one of the most bizarre things in terms of human connection via an online portal, like if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I've had the experience multiple times in the last couple of years where I can't be totally certain whether I have met somebody in person because it's been the equivalent. I feel like we've been sitting face to face for hours, and then the question is, well, have we ever been in the same room? I guess not.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to let you know I was listening to a podcast with you and Heather the other day, and you had this moment. You were trying to read an ad, and you were messing it up, and then Heather was sort of correcting you all the time, and then you started to laugh like a little boy for uncontrollably for about 10 minutes. You guys could not get it together, and it was just the most beautiful moment. It was like I was pissing myself laughing in the car, listening to you, trying to struggle through this ad. It was just a great depiction of your relationship. I'd imagine, minus the ups and downs of normal relationships, it seems to be a match made in heaven.
Oh yeah. I mean, I never doubt that I'm with exactly the right person. So that's a tremendous thing to be able to say, especially after all of the years that we've been together. We've been together since 1989.
Wow.
So that's a lot of ground we've covered together. And yeah, no, I think what people see on the podcast, it's obviously not the whole thing, but it's definitely an honest edit of our relationship. And that ad read situation was an anomaly. I mean, I've definitely the giggles are ultimately what's going to bring me down. I'm pretty certain, um, but you didn't happen to catch the next episode of the podcast because we explained what happened to us.
All right. Explain. I didn't get it.
Okay, so we were, I think, 3.5 days into a 7-day dry fast. That's no food,
Right.
no water.
Yep.
And that had two impacts. One, it does things to you cognitively. But the other thing is we didn't have any water on the table. And usually when the giggles are in danger of taking over, you drink a little water. And I think it's your self-protective circuits that try to keep you from drowning, that as soon as you're in contact with water, it kind of arrests the giggles. And we just didn't have the tools available, or had we had them on the table, we wouldn't have been drinking because we were trying to make it 7 days without any water. And so anyway, it kind of got away from us. Yeah.
Yeah. It was hilarious from my end. I must have watched a little clip that you put together on Instagram of that because you send each other reels of food when you're fasting, and that's something that my partner and I do as well. We're going to do a 3-day fast, and then next minute we're just getting all the most mouth-watering, fucking delicious food, and it's so tantalizing to the ear and to the eyes, and you're salivating at this thought, and you're like, why are you doing this to me? But then, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, it went from, you know, a slight tease to actually a weird kind of pleasure thinking about the food that you might be able to enjoy, a couple weeks hence. And so anyway, yeah, we were kind of into sending that stuff back and forth. And then it's funny, at day 5, the hunger evaporated, but the thirst intensified.
Mm,
And so we started sending each other pictures of,
just water.
mostly just water.
That's so good. What do you? I've never done a dry fast before, but I have done upwards of 5 days of fasting just with water.
Yep.
What do you crave the most? Like I find when I do get to the thought of the moment where I can eat again is coming, and the things that I desire are so bizarre. I mean, it's not really bizarre in a sense like I'd love to sit down to a steak or a chicken parmigiana or something like that. I'm like, man, just give me a slice of bread. Just one
Right.
slice of bread would be amazing. Just that white, the shitty white one that is not good for you, all right? But just give me that bit with a bit of butter. I would be in like, I'll be so satisfied with that experience.
Yeah, for me, and I know for Heather, it's more likely to be just a really delicious piece of fruit.
Mm,
The perfect peach or the perfect mango is just, it doesn't get better than that.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Something nice and juicy. You just want to stick
Oh,
your,
yeah,
your mouth around. Yeah, that's awesome.
totally.
All right. Well, mate, look, we've got a lot to talk about. I really respect your time and appreciate the fact that you're lending me your ear for a little while. So I would love to tackle a topic which I know you've danced around and you've had a really good conversation with Jessica Rose recently. I had Jessica Rose on the podcast about a year and a bit ago around the fact that there are people like myself who lean towards that there was really no pathogen or virus or anything going around, and there's others that are that believe that it was definitely a real thing, and we all experienced it, and we had our own version of what the events were. But then also the overarching feud now between who believes in viruses and who doesn't, and who believes that it was a complete psyop, and who believes it was actually a real thing that went around the world. And the reason why I want to talk to this is for several reasons, but in more recent days, I did a podcast with Zuby and I put it up on social media to say, I've had Zuby on the podcast, go and listen to it. And then someone posted a photo of the new information gatekeepers of the world. And your name and face was up there. Russell Brand was there. Joe Rogan was there. And it's this pit against who is actually now the new Illuminati or the new gatekeepers of information that are protecting. Do you follow me? It's like
Oh, yeah.
a war. It's like a war of light now. It's like, man, 2 years ago we were arguing against them, whoever they are, and now it's like your disinformation and you're a controlled opposition, and the fact that you don't believe that viruses, the fact that you do believe that virus existed because other people are saying they never existed and there's no such thing as a virus. You see where I'm going with this, and I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
you're
No,
right.
I'm well prepared and eager to talk about this. And frankly, I think it needs to be talked about because um, most people who are just bystanders do not understand the various different camps.
Mm.
I don't think almost anybody understands who those camps are and what they're really saying and what would be true if they had it correct and that. So anyway, I'm happy to have that discussion. Sure.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, let's have it. Do you want me to express what my personal experience was?
Sure.
So when the virus first started coming out here in Australia, we had this thing where we had this a cruise ship called the Ruby Princess from memory, and it landed on the shores, which is like 5 minutes away from where I live. And within a few short weeks, we were shut down because the people that were infected on that boat got off into my hometown and went to our local hospital, and so it set everyone into a spin. I shit my pants because I just thought, well, it's something that I thought was a bit of a hyped up thing because I've heard of SARS and all of these sort of swine flus and things that have been touted over the years. So it didn't really feel like it was, it felt like it was very ramped up and politicized, and the media was all over it. But then when this ship entered the shore, I was like, man, maybe it is a thing. And I sort of leaned towards a suspicious conspiratorial mind anyway. So I had my doubts. I was fearful. I started to get a little bit sick at that time, but it was because my business was shut down. I was stressed out and all the rest of it. As the years progressed and I started talking to people like yourself, the Pierre Coreys and the Peter McCullers of the world, I started to think that it was more of a psyop than anything to get people to race towards the vaccine, which was the real thing that they wanted people to get into their veins. So it was like a big boogeyman, and it was and it was just designed to help you so fearful and so bamboozled, because there was all these things that were going on that were very confusing, that it made you run towards the safest option, which was to inoculate yourself, and that way you'd be protected and your grandma would be safe and all the rest of it. So my personal experience was in the later part of 2023, late 22, early 23, I did get about a sickness which resulted in me bedridden for a couple of days. I did have like lower back pain. I started to experience the lesser sense of smell and taste. Nothing that completely disappeared, but it was definitely lessened. In my experience, though, I've had that about 10 years ago, not to the severity that I had it, but it was still a similar experience. So that's my personal take, without interjecting all of the nuances of what did and didn't happen and all that sort of stuff. So that's how I come to believe that I feel it was mostly a plan to get you to take something that was immensely profitable for all those people behind that thing.
Well, I listened very carefully to what you said, and there's almost nothing in your description that I disagree with, which speaks to the subtlety of this landscape. That is to say, what you said that I think puts you squarely in the realm of the most parsimonious explanation is that it was mostly a psyop. I agree it was mostly a psyop, but most of the people who would go that far would likely say there was no novel pathogen. I would certainly not say there was no novel pathogen. I believe there was a novel pathogen. I don't believe there was a pandemic, but I do believe there was a novel pathogen that circulated globally. Might have been more than one. I'm agnostic about what that pathogen was, because, of course, how would I know? But these are the details that I think we have to be very specific about, so we know when it is that we are actually disagreeing over something substantive.
Agreed. Yep. So I think from listening to your podcast with Dr. Jessica Rose, we are mostly in agreement as well. I am not fully convinced that there are no such thing as viruses, because I've listened to the several people who say viruses don't exist. But I do experience many symptoms of viruses that go around. So to me, what computes in my mind is that there are such things as things that cause problems within your body. And whether you want to name it a virus or you want to name it mucus or snot or whatever, like whatever it is, it's got a name to it. So that's what I think's going around. But I don't necessarily believe that the pathogen or the virus from the Wuhan lab and all the rest of it was the thing that they say it was. I have read, or I want to ask you, have you looked into radiation poisoning, things to do with 5G networks and ramping up of cell towers, people being stuck in their screens the whole time, and no sunlight, and eating shitty food, and just thinking like I'm going to be sick? Like there's certainly an element of that which makes people ill. You know, you can worry yourself to death, Brett. Like it's one of
course.
That's a fact, right? So,
but I think this is where we go from an evidence-based worldview to a things that you cannot falsify and therefore are forced to consider. So the reason, first of all, viruses, I can't say anything for sure. I can't say that I exist for certain, right? I certainly can't say you exist for certain. Right? I have one piece of evidence that I exist that I don't have for anybody else. But the point is, how far do you get in life if you doubt everything, if you become effectively cynical about facts.
Mhm.
So what I'm left with is if evidence means anything at all, there's a tremendous amount of evidence for the existence of viruses. I mean, some viruses we can actually just simply see with an electron micrograph. I also know that the pattern in which you worry yourself into a state of sickness does not well explain the pattern of contagion that seems to follow viruses as we know them. In other words, there was a moment, I believe, that Heather and my older son, Zach, had whatever the novel virus was that was circulating that went on to be known as COVID. They had that in February of 2020,
Right.
before it was supposed to be circulating in the
Okay.
US,
And way before the injections.
way before the injections. And I know because, without dragging your audience too deeply into the story, I did not know that I was allergic to wheat for decades, and I gave myself a case of asthma. I now take my allergy to wheat as likely the result of an adverse reaction to a flu vaccine. But nonetheless, I had a mysterious case of asthma, which I have now cured by eliminating wheat from my diet. But in any case, over all of the years that I was eating wheat and had that case of asthma, I did a lot of damage to my lungs, and I tend, therefore, to be very vulnerable to respiratory pathogens. So when I saw Heather, my wife, and my older son get terribly ill with a respiratory virus, I was extremely afraid that I was going to get it and that it was going to hit me even harder than it was hitting them.
Mm.
And I didn't get it. So if worry was going to induce it, that would have been the case. Now, I did go on to get what I believe was SARS-CoV-2 a couple of times during the so-called pandemic. And so it's not that this thing doesn't affect me, it's that worry is not the correct predictor, because I was as worried in February of 2020 as I ever got about the severity of this respiratory pathogen before I even realized what it was. Um, and then that said, the pattern where somebody comes home from school or work sick, and then the illness spreads to other people, not immediately, but with several days break. In fact, you may even think, hey, I got away with it. I didn't catch this one. And then it hits you.
Mm.
That pattern is not a good match for this being psychosomatic. That pattern is a good match for there being a particle that creates a pattern of symptoms as it hijacks your cells in order to spread itself forward through time. So I do believe that there are viruses. I do believe that something novel was circulating probably beginning in the fall of 2019.
Hmm.
I believe that what we thought we knew about the symptoms that followed from it was largely a psyop. And we now know that many of the videos that we, for example, saw about people keeling over in the street in China were phony, and that did induce us in the public, and maybe more importantly, doctors, to anticipate a much more dangerous pathogen than actually showed up, which caused them to overreact, which then resulted in a number of deaths, which were credited to COVID, which caused the panic to spread even farther and faster.
Hmm.
So the key thing that I think we have to do is not dismiss the circulation of a novel pathogen just because the evidence that the pathogen was highly deadly, that it matched the symptoms we had been led to expect, did not turn out to be true. The question is, if you ask me, could what happened have been largely the result of a psyop had there been no pathogen? My answer would have to be yes. I believe there was a mass formation that occurred around the idea of a deadly pathogen, that the pathogen, as terribly unfortunate for humanity as it is, was not highly deadly and did not merit the kind of panic that we saw. It did not merit the countermeasures, which were both ill-fated and ill-considered. Um, and I don't hear anybody basically speaking from this perspective.
Mm.
This was simultaneously a tragedy for humanity, and I have no trouble defending that in what I believe are very rigorous terms, and nothing that required the response that we delivered and from which almost all of the harms derived. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, um, what I would say as a biologist is many of the people who argue that there was no novel pathogen have a correct element to their incorrect view on what happened. The correct element is human beings are not nearly good enough at engineering natural phenomena like viruses to create a superbug. That's not what happened. What they are capable of doing is getting a pathogen that does not ordinarily infect humans and certainly cannot jump between them and bridging that gap for the pathogen. And I would use the following analogy. There's only one mammal species natively in Hawaii. It's a bat. There are, however, mongoose in Hawaii. Is that the result of science? Absolutely. Is it the result of scientists being good enough to make a mongoose? I mean, that's such a ridiculous level of distinction between what biologists are actually capable of and the production of a mongoose. It's just not, it's a non-starter. But what human beings are capable of doing is producing something like a ship or an airplane that can take a mongoose from where they natively exist and bring them to Hawaii, from which point selection takes over and presumably takes the mongoose that's adapted to elsewhere and adapts it to the Hawaiian habitat. There's nothing sci-fi about that. And so, do I believe that human beings created this bioweapon? No. What I think they did was got really excited when they found a virus that already had the earliest rudiments of the capacity to infect human beings. And then they trained it in a lab to get better at jumping between human beings.
Mhm.
And then it got out by whatever mechanism, right? That's not a story that requires genius level biology. That's a story that requires nothing but biological diligence and a foolhardy nature in which you would attempt such a thing. So I do believe a novel pathogen got out. I believe we can tell that there was a novel pathogen circulating by the fact that we had a novel pattern of symptoms and that it roughly tracks with our understanding of when. If we set the date for its release back to the fall of 2019, it actually explains a lot of phenomenology on Earth. That said, on the whole, this is something that appears somewhere between a cold and a flu in terms
Mm.
of its seriousness. And the reason that it is simultaneously not that big a deal and a huge tragedy is that it added one more to the list of human pathogens that we have to deal with. And it's a pathogen that, as far as we can tell, we will never be rid of. So let's say that it's a quarter as bad as the flu in terms of how much harm it does to the body and how much of your life it's going to eat up, or how much of your life it eats up in any one go.
Mhm.
But you're going to get it 4 times as often, and you're going to be getting it for the rest of your life. And each time you get it, it's going to do a certain amount of damage that you won't be able to reverse. That's a huge amount of harm for the arrogance of a small number of people to have inflicted on humanity into the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that is for sure. So you don't believe that i- it was designed or purposely let out into the wild to create the havoc that it did on the basis that we could then create something that people could take and we could make, trillions of dollars from? Or do you think that it was an accident?
Um, let's put it this way. I have not seen the evidence that suggests that it was an intentional release. So I do not believe strongly that it was an accident, but I do believe that on balance, the evidence suggests that it was an accident. But it's an accident then that people in a position to make a huge amount of money on capitalized on. And in so doing, I believe they took something which we, in the early phases, might have driven extinct and caused it to become a permanent fellow traveler of humanity.
Mm.
So I'm not without an appreciation for just how cynical it is that the forces that allowed this to happen were. And if you told me that there was evidence of an intentional release, I would want to look at it, because that's certainly um, a plausible explanation, but
Yeah.
it's not one I would want to leap to without some sort of indication that is beyond just simple speculation.
Mm. Look, I get what you're saying, and I think I agree. I don't have any evidence that says without a doubt this is 100% released onto humanity on purpose and by design. However, I've heard you talk to a bunch of people over the last couple of years, and I've certainly listened and had the same conversations of Anthony Fauci back in the 80s and doing his thing what he did with HIV, and um, Bill Gates sending vaccines to Africa that were banned in the US. And so, like that, you could say is arguably a well-known intention to make money off something that is harmful to human beings. So, I don't feel with that knowledge, knowing that I don't have any direct information that says this was definitely released to the public with a malfeasance, or it was intentional that way. But there's certainly evidence in the past that suggests that it has been done before. So it gives me, I guess, more weight on the fact on that it's a higher probability than something that just escaped out of a lab, because I know that gain of function is not something new, and I know there's laboratories all over the world. We have one here in Melbourne that was working on viruses of the same nature. So I know it's a thing, but I think the history points more towards the fact that it probably, or at least higher probability that it was an intentional thing than it wasn't.
Well, I guess I would just, again, draw the line somewhere very carefully. I would say I would not put it past them. There's nothing about um, the horror of the moral lapse that would have been involved in releasing it that I see as falsifying. Yes, people might release such a thing intentionally. But the question is, it's a little bit a version of, Bertrand Russell's teapot orbiting the sun. I don't think there is one. Why? Because there's no evidence of it, but it could be there. So again, I want to see a document in which somebody discusses the possibility of releasing this and gives some indication of what their purpose might have been. Otherwise, I'm going to very tentatively conclude that the most likely thing is that people were engaged in exactly the kind of gain of function research that we know they were engaged in, that they created an infectious human pathogen and it got away from them. And, I await evidence that it was more than that.
Mm. Did you ever get the vaccine? Is that something that you and Heather had decided to go and get, and then changed your tune after that? I don't think I've ever heard that side of you before. Is that something that you did? Because I know a few other doctors are like, I went and got it, and then realized that they either had an adverse reaction or it was not the thing that they thought they were getting, and later changed their tune on whether it was as effective as what they first believed.
Yes, we did not get it. We did not have it given to our children either. In 2020, we released a book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. And in that book, you will find a claim that vaccines are among the three greatest triumphs of medical science, the other two being surgery and antibiotics. So that's a good test of what our mindset with respect to vaccines was in 2020. I wouldn't write that sentence again if I had it to do over. But what happened to us is we heard tell that the vaccines were on their way and that was going to allow planet Earth to go back to normal. We were initially believing of the claim that they were highly effective at preventing the contraction and transmission of the disease. Later on, we would discover that that's nonsense. But early in the vaccine campaign, our sense was a very effective vaccine has just shown up, but we're being told that vaccine is based on a brand new technology that's never been released into humans before. It's never been tested on humans before, and that it's safe. And those two things would not possibly be simultaneously true.
Hmm.
If you've got a brand new technology that's never been tested on human beings before and it's just been produced in less than a year, then if there's one thing you can be certain of, it's that nobody on earth knows how safe this is. And therefore, the fact that we were being told that it was safe was obviously a lie. And being lied to about such a thing caused us to basically look at each other and say, you know what? We're healthy. This disease does not appear highly deadly to people our age who are healthy. What we're going to do is we are going to wait as long as possible before we get the shot and see if any pattern of harm emerges that we should know about. And of course, as soon as we decided to wait, it just allowed time for the evidence of harm to accumulate. And by the time we were even eligible, our thought was, no way,
Wow.
we're not taking it. And so we didn't. And of course, like everybody else who didn't take the shot, we're very grateful.
Mm. What were you experiencing in your own circle of friends or people that you were just reading about or?
A couple things. Yes, in my own circle of friends, and these are people, many of whom I did not meet during the pandemic. So these are somewhat like a random sample of the population. I do have a number of stories of friends who had very serious adverse reactions. I also, I have long utilized my motion through the world as a way of taking an informal census of things. I always talk to hairdressers and cabbies and clerks and anybody I run into. I find it fascinating. These are human beings living different lives than mine. And, a few minutes of interaction, that's a bargain. If you can find something out about them in exchange for telling them something about you, why wouldn't you do it?
Mhm.
So as I was traveling the world, not taking the vaccine and increasingly taking heat for not taking the vaccine, I was talking to people about what their experience had been, most of whom had gotten it. And I was shocked at how many people had a really frightening story about what had befallen them or somebody close to them. Um, and it was so common in the set of answers that I received that it was almost unbelievable. Like,
Mm.
was I traveling in some part of the world that had gotten a bad batch of these things? Well, that didn't make sense because I was frankly traveling all over the country and interacting with people. It can't have been one batch. So anyway, I came to believe that the adverse events were much more common than we knew, which of course was then reflected in the VAERS database, which is of course rigged to collect a very tiny percentage of the actual adverse events, and yet had this unprecedented signal in which the COVID so-called vaccines had more serious adverse events than all other vaccines combined over a 30-year period. So, yes, the pattern was unmistakable as soon as one decided to go looking for it. And it was up against this incredibly high energy coercion campaign to get you to ignore it, cross your fingers, and just go get the damn shot, which was a very strange experience to live through, frankly.
Wasn't it? Yeah. I get Facebook memories all the time. Like every day something comes up and it's typically getting to that, 2 and 3 and 4 year period where things show up. And just some of the articles that were posted and the things that I was saying and it makes me laugh these days. I get angry and then I laugh at things because it was so ridiculous. But I remember reading that tall people would get it, bald people were more susceptible to getting it. It was in fecal matter and in the sewers and just all of these things. And I'm sure it was the same where you are, but like I live on the coast, so we're sort of 5 minutes from the beach. But this thing we were all shut down. I just opened up a brand new business in January 10, and so by March 28 we were shut, and I'd had all this debt in front of me and no way of trading out of it. So I was just dying the death of 1,000 paper cuts. And but at the same time, we were allowed to go 5 kilometer in a 5 kilometer radius from our house. So we would naturally go to the beach because it's like 2 kilometers away, and I'd be there with 10,000 other people enjoying the sunshine in what could arguably the worst pandemic that we've ever seen in the last 100 years. And I would jokingly say, I'm risking my life to tell you how bad it isn't, you know? So just stay in outdoors and don't risk your life and all the rest of it. And it was a play on words, but I was just constantly mocked and ridiculed and just told that I was an idiot, right? And I've been in my hometown all of my life. I've been in business for 20 plus years. So people know who I am. And so all of a sudden I went from this person who was just a business person to someone who was an absolute lunatic, and everyone wanted to run me out of town. That's why I started the podcast, because I used to interview people about business and making money. And then all of a sudden this thing happened. I started to talk to like Pierre Corey and Christian Northrup and Roger Hodgkinson and Peter McCullough and all these anyone that would listen to me really and give me a moment at a time, because I thought I can't be the only fucking lunatic on this planet which is seeing things for what they really are.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is what's misleading people in the present is that the PSYOP was industrial strength. And I think people are just not, frankly, very good at logic. At some level, once you've seen an industrial strength PSYOP that accounts for most of the phenomenology, people will leap to the conclusion that it was a PSYOP rather than you had a highly manageable pathogen that was turned into something much more consequential by denying us the tools with which to manage it, and was used as a pretext for deploying a set of shots that I believe hung in a strange kind of limbo in advance of the so-called pandemic. We had this mRNA platform. It was potentially maybe the greatest pharmaceutical triumph in history, but for the fact that it couldn't be brought to market with normal safety testing. It was just simply too dangerous and couldn't be fixed. So they used an emergency to not only deploy the shot into people under an emergency use authorization, but to normalize it in the public mind.
Yes.
Right? So this I get. Once you see that they did that, you think, well, maybe that was the whole point. Maybe they released the virus. And I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm just saying I have yet to see that evidence. The evidence I've seen so far supports a virus that was engineered into a state that it could spread between people, which escaped, presumably from the Wuhan lab, though that's not certain. It could have been released so as to look as if it came from the Wuhan lab, but the evidence we have suggests it came from the Wuhan lab. And that once it was released, people who understood the potential of the mRNA platform jumped on it in order to use it as the Trojan horse to usher in the mRNA technology era, which is where we now live.
Yeah, yeah. And it's still pretty wild out there. Like I'd imagine you'd be coming across it every single day with people who are, absolutely steadfast on the fact that they did the best thing they could with the knowledge that they had, and the shots were the right thing, and everything was done the way it should have been, and not mismanaged at all. So that's that to me still is mind-boggling. And like the thing we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, that you've now got this newfound cat amongst the pigeons of people fighting each other on whether it was or wasn't real, or it's a virus exists or they don't, and they're pitting themselves against each other to the degree that it creates more confusion and more divide and conquer type of strategies and tactics, which are eons old, I guess.
Yes, and it is, to my way of thinking, vitally important that we actually figure out what happened. Whatever the truth may be, we need to understand it as well as we can while the evidence still exists, because at the end of the day, If my understanding is correct, then this is likely the greatest blunder in human history,
Mm,
because even a pathogen of limited capacity to harm, if we are stuck with it indefinitely, that harm will accumulate over human generations going forward. Not only was creating it insane, but failing to take advantage of the very brief period at the very beginning after it had escaped to attempt to drive it extinct will prove to be a catastrophic error. Right. And not only did we not do what you might have done to drive it extinct, but we were denied the very tools that were most likely to be valuable, including drugs that existed on the shelf that rendered the disease perfectly manageable in almost every case, and also had the capacity to reduce the R naught value below 1. And once you reduce the R naught value below 1, extinction actually becomes inevitable if you can hold it there.
mm. Yeah, that was the most scary time, I feel. It was, and the censorship of information. It really it rattled me. I remember going through a lot of inner turmoil because I couldn't figure it out, and I was perplexed to the degree that in some ways I was isolated and had caused this sort of state of inertia where I didn't know whether to move forward or backwards or sideways or what. And I just got really angry and just really pissed off with the world and everyone around me. It was a pretty dark moment.
It was a tremendously dark moment. Now, I will say, I think the lesson would have been impossible to learn absent that dark moment. And so the real tragedy will be if we let the darkness of that moment escape us and we go back to thinking that that was an anomaly rather than that was a preview of what we will end up doing to ourselves if we don't sober up rapidly.
Mm,
So, I would say one of my top 2 or 3 priorities at the moment is to ensure that we get a final reckoning on exactly what happened over the course of COVID so that, one, we can make sure it never happens again, but two, we can use the opportunity to look at the illness of our system because it revealed the dysfunction in every single important institution, right? We watched the media fail, journalists failed across the board. We watched every single university and medical school fail. We watched governmental failure. And these are very dangerous vulnerabilities if we do not figure out how to correct them.
mm, agreed. When you were talking to Tucker about the deaths, there was a viral clip that went around, and you were speaking to the number of excess deaths and mortality around the world. And then more recently, I heard another podcast I think on your podcast with Nick Dowd about the
And
data that he's been extrapolating out of the world data. Is there anything that you can share with me that is updated from that, or something maybe some of my listeners hadn't heard about what that is? Because that is a topic of contention. It's certainly something that a lot of people are saying that like sudden deaths always happened, and that's something that never was an anomaly, and they don't believe that there is excess mortality, and in fact the world is growing at a rapid rate in terms of population.
yes, so there were a couple of numbers circulated. The first number, the one I mentioned on Tucker, was Denny Rancourt's number, 17 million dead globally. Um, Ed Dowd on my podcast was discussing his estimate, in which 17 million was the upper bound, but it was not their estimate of the expected number. I've forgotten what his expected number was exactly, but it's quite clear that there were tens of millions of excess deaths. I don't think that that's a particularly good way of evaluating the harm, because there's also a lot of dysfunction. There's a question about the quality of years lost. One of the greatest crimes in the entire pharmaceutical component of the so-called pandemic was the failure to age stratify. So if you believed, and I no longer believe this, but if you believed that the vaccines were efficacious at preventing serious disease and death, then the argument should have been to give them to people who were at significant risk of serious disease or death, which was almost nobody. That was people who were really old, really infirm, or both. And there is no reasonable argument for giving these vaccines to young, healthy people, especially children, for two different reasons. One, young, healthy people experienced almost no risk of serious disease or death from COVID itself. And two, young, healthy people have long lives ahead of them. So if you injure them with a shot, the harm to them is much greater than the harm to somebody who's in their 70s or 80s who might have, a decade degraded, but not an entire life. And yet what we are doing still is recommending these shots in the US. They're recommended even for anybody 6 months or older. That is an unthinkably insane thing to do, to vaccinate against a disease that carries no risk for people who are young and healthy. And in the case that you have no ability to estimate what the long-term implications of those vaccines are for the people you're vaccinating. Are you making them in the end more vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2? Are you making them more vulnerable to other diseases that might carry greater jeopardy? We don't know the answers to that question. So on what basis are we giving this shot? Why are we recommending it for people who stand to gain nothing? Right? The argument was always that it protects the vulnerable, but what reasonable society sacrifices its young to protect the old? That's just not a reasonable thing to do. And it's not a conversation that we ever had. So anyway, the system is completely out of control.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Completely out of control. And, we know that there's a huge spike in excess deaths. We know that that huge spike does not track SARS-CoV-2, that it does track the release of the shots, that we see the absence of what would be called a pull forward effect, which ought to truly terrify us. And I will take a moment to explain what this is and why it's so frightening. Under ordinary circumstances, if you had, let's say, a terrible drought in a part of the world where people were dependent on groundwater, you would expect to see a pulse of extra deaths, people who were fragile, who were pushed over the brink by the lack of water. But then in the following years, you would expect to see a deficit of excess deaths because the vulnerable people will have disproportionately already died, leaving people who were more or better positioned to survive a stress. So you would expect to see a bump of excess deaths followed by a dearth of excess deaths. That's not what we see at all. We see a big bump in excess deaths upon the introduction of the shots, and it continues to be in excess. That pull forward effect has not resulted in the vulnerable disappearing. Apparently, there are continually more vulnerable who are taking these shots, and we haven't seen the follow-on dip yet. So whatever the harm is, it's not minor.
Wow. That is really frightening. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, when I know over the years you've often talked to the things that everyone should be most frightened about humanity and where it's heading. And what I love about your work is that it's very thorough and diplomatic and well processed and thought out and solutions based. And that's something that I've tried to talk to our local politicians about and everyone around the world to say, okay, now that we know this, what do we do? In more recent months, you've rallied a number of people together. You've organized events to back a new wave of people who support Donald Trump running the country and all those sorts of things. I wanted to get your opinion on that because one of the things that really stood out for me from a political standpoint was Operation Warp Speed, and all of these sort of things were like Trump initiated, and now that there seems to be a bit of a backflip on those things, it worries me about some of the motivations politically. Is there things to your knowledge, because you now sort of rub shoulders with most of these people? I really wanted RFK to get somewhere in the front, and I'm glad that he's with Trump. But I would love to have the system allow him to be an independent candidate. I think he speaks more true to my core values and belief systems. But that's just me, and I'm just one little guy over here in Australia. But it's sort of a lot of questions in one statement. But I wanted to get your views on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've had quite a political journey. I remain a staunch liberal in my values, and I am still a Democrat, though I do not vote for Democrats at the federal level anymore. So to find myself aligned personally with Donald Trump is quite a surprise for me. That said, I'm hopeful that he, having learned the lesson of his first term, is in a position to set the nation and, in fact, the entire West on a new course that is terribly overdue. I'm quite grateful that Bobby Kennedy decided to step out of the race and back Donald Trump. I think that that likely is what put Donald Trump over the top, and I think it
Agreed.
was a courageous and patriotic move on Bobby's part, and I commend him for doing it. That said, I have one biggest concern about Trump, and it's that for reasons that I think have to do with personal pride, he cannot accept that he made a terrible error with Operation Warp Speed. And I wish I have not yet had the opportunity to sit down with him. And I don't know if I did sit down with him, if I would destroy whatever opportunity I might have to persuade him of important things on this one topic. But if I had the opportunity to speak to him about it, I would say, Mr. President, there's nobody, no decent person who would hold you responsible for the horrors of Operation Warp Speed if you simply told them, you know what, I was bamboozled by people who I thought knew a great deal more about this than I did. We all get that because, frankly, unless you were so cynical that you weren't listening to anything you were being told, we all got bamboozled at one level or another.
Mhm.
Everybody has it in their heart to forgive them if you can acknowledge what you got wrong. Now, if the president would acknowledge, you know what, I thought that this was the right thing to do for America and for the world at the time, so I did it. The benefit of hindsight tells me that it was a mistake for reasons I did not understand and that I don't think any of us fully understand. And if there's one thing that I think we must do, it's get to the bottom of it. If he could bring himself to do that, then I believe we would have a brand new chapter, because as I said before, COVID is the story that diagnoses the system. It lets us see all of the dysfunction and the corruption, and it allows us to become wiser about a great many things, from how to face down the corrupting influences that come from pharma that have captured public health and that have used it to stage a coup against medicine. Um, it would allow us uh, to overcome the scary stories that we've been told by the people in virology that have us falsely believing that the next pandemic is just around the corner, ready to leap out of some wild animal into a person and, set Spanish flu in motion again, or whatever it's going to be. This is nonsense, and we have to learn to stare it down. And the story that gives us the best hope of doing that is the COVID story. It lets us see all of the things that went wrong so we can learn the lesson and go forward as a wiser species.
Yeah, I I'm hopeful of the same thing. I would add to that I hope that now we've seen the light and the dark and the very dark, that people will understand that their complacency will be to their demise, and they need to hold everyone accountable for when things don't go well. You know, like in any relationship, if I ignore red flags with you, Brett, then they just build up to be so insurmountable to the degree that I just get the shits one day and then walk out, and we're never to see each other again. Had I had difficult conversations with you along the way, we could establish a understanding and some boundaries and mutual respect for one another, to which we could grow and blossom a great relationship. And as esoteric as that sounds, I think it's not far off what we should be doing as a society with the political leaders that we elect to run the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll tell you, I learned a tremendous amount personally by making mistakes and then correcting them over the course of the COVID pandemic as I came to understand what the evidence actually pointed to. And we all need to be ready to do that. Frankly, I believe that the mRNA shots have killed tens of millions of people, or 10 plus million people on Earth, and that there's no end in sight, especially since the technology is being used as the basis for many new so-called vaccines that are on the drawing board. If it turns out that that's not true, I don't want to pretend that it is true. I want to find out that it's not true. Maybe these things are safer than I think they are. Maybe the evidence doesn't say what I think it does. And will that be a fun moment? No, I'm going to be embarrassed if I find out I've got it wrong, as I've been embarrassed before having gotten other things wrong. But I'd far rather come to discover the truth and get to the right side as quickly as possible than defend a wrong belief and continue to compound the damage.
Mm. Yeah, that's well said. When you talk to the things that are on the horizon that humanity should be fearful of, I listened to a podcast with you on the Diary of a CEO, and you talked about several things, including AI and things like that, that we should be worried about. Are you alleviated to the degree that things are heading in the right direction, or are you more aligned with we should be dubious and worrisome about certain things to do with technology? So in my view, there's a clear divide now between the what I would consider the old world, cash and a simple life with very few complexities, and then we're heading to this age of technology and AI integration, and people integrating themselves with robotics and the likes, and then we have this gender thing, which is a beast into its own, which anyone can agree or disagree with. I am in the agreement that there's only two genders, but there's it's one of the things that it seems to be there's a clear divide. You've got people running for the country, and you've got people embracing that this new world is upon us. So with that being said, are you still very fearful of the future? Or are you optimistic at all?
Well, I of course think I'm a realist. I'm a lot more hopeful than I was even a month ago,
I bet.
because at least I believe that the people who are about to be in charge are well intentioned and open to a reasoned argument about what we should and shouldn't be frightened of. We've got a lot of work to do. We've left many of these things far too long, and so we're behind the eight ball with respect to addressing hazards from solar storms, for example. We've unleashed AI onto the world without properly preparing ourselves. And, as much as I don't fear the sci-fi catastrophe that many fear, at least not at the same level that they do, I do think that there are inevitable hazards that come from the AI for which we're not even a little bit prepared. And I wish we had prepared better. But, look, it's always a struggle. Humanity has nearly gone extinct multiple times. I believe we are facing a bottleneck, but we're also pretty good at thinking our way out of these things if we can focus on them. So my point on the podcast that you watched was, let's worry about the right stuff, right? This is always a diminishing returns problem, and there's things that we can do nothing about. There's, things that could loom up out of deep space and obliterate us, and there's very little we can do to prepare. So that means that preparing for those things is a waste of time. You should prepare for those things where you have a substantial chance of changing the odds. And there are a great many things where we have a substantial chance of changing the odds where we're not bothering because we are afraid of the wrong stuff. We're too afraid of global warming and not afraid enough of the dynamics of the galaxy and the solar system.
Yeah. Before I let you go, would I be true in assuming that you're like a really smart hippie? Have you got this like minus the long hair and the detachment from government and living on a farm or something like that? I don't know where you live, but is that a somewhat accurate statement to where you sort of live in the love and light and connectedness, and then also this practical realist worldview of how things are?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it in those terms, but
I
you're
bet.
detecting something real, and the answer to it, you should have met my grandfather. My
Really?
grandfather would explain the whole thing to you. You'd understand it because he came from a tradition of very high integrity liberals who were also very hard headed. And that's the thing is I grew up in a household where there was no conflict at all between a belief in deeply rigorous science and a belief in the gloriousness of nature and the beauty of love. And those things were just perfectly at home with each other. And so, um, this does not feel like a contradiction to me in the slightest. It feels like, where are the other liberals who understand that the way to achieve the values that we hold is to understand the world as well as we can and not tell ourselves lies about it, but come to understand it as it is and figure out, if you're the kind of liberal who thinks you're going to make the perfect wave to surf it, well, I know what's going to happen to you. The question is, you've got the waves you've got. Figure out how to surf them, accept the waves and surf them as a matter, it's an art form, right? And that's the thing. The universe isn't going to become nicer, but we can certainly make more of it. We can make ourselves safer. We can make ourselves more fulfilled. We can make more progress with the gifts that we've been given. And I can't imagine why we wouldn't do it.
Hmm. I like it. Brett, you've been a great pleasure to talk to. I really like your style and the way that you deliver information. I've gotten to know you enough over the last couple of years to see snippets of how connected you are to nature and the world and other humans and the value of relationships. Um, I got to see you giggle the other day for minutes on end, uncontrollably, which is a real beautiful human element that we have to thank podcasting and the internet and all that for. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get an insight as to how people are in their behavioral styles and how they deliver things and all that kind of stuff. And I really respect you and Heather for the work that you're doing in the midst of this sort of catastrophic like propulsion into the limelight. And you would have copped your fair share of criticism along the way, but you still are very steadfast and you stick to your values and your beliefs, and you're quite embodied and congruent with all of those. So I just want to tell you that.
Well, thank you. That's lovely to hear. And, what a marvelous moment that we get to have that human connection over this great a distance. It's been a
Yeah,
really fun conversation. So thank
yeah.
you.
No, thank you. I look forward to circling back sometime soon, but until then, I'll talk to you soon.
Great.
All
All
right,
right.
bye
I
for
really
now.
enjoyed it. Bye now.